at the end. If you could just pop those questions in the Q&A box specifically, and we will get to your questions at the end of the event. Now, all of that housekeeping out of the way, David, did you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thanks, Olivia. And look, I acknowledge I'm on Gadigal land and pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. We're all on First Nations land in this country, and we have an enormous collective obligation to walk together with First Nations peoples to ensure that we empower them and to do everything we can to deliver land, treaty and self-determination. And whenever you're talking about law reform and the law going wrong and misfiring, particularly the criminal justice law, we know that some of the people who are most likely to get targeted with badly crafted laws are First Nations peoples. This has to be a collective effort to make the place fairer. We are really lucky tonight to, first of all, to have Olivia from Sniff Off. Olivia's taken over Sniff Off for what seems ages, but has only been a few short weeks. And I've got to say, Olivia has really, I think, been super engaging and building the Sniff Off project with a kind of sassy, kind of fun voice, but also really intelligent analysis. And that's what I think we expect in Sniff Off, that mixture of kind of enjoyable interaction, but also some really intelligent analysis about what's gone so horribly wrong, not just with drug dogs, but with drug laws more generally in this country. And you couldn't have something more wrong than the way in which the roadside drug testing regime operates. And that's why I think we're really lucky to have our first speaker tonight, David Heilpern. David spent 21 long years as a magistrate, was actually put to the bench by a pretty left-wing AG at the time in 1998. We were having a chat beforehand, and one of the team said, geez, David, that was before I was born. So it's been a bit of time, not a little, it's been a bit of time, an extraordinary amount of time, a huge amount of public commitment working as a magistrate. A lot of that time was up on the North Coast. And if you follow the data about where the police really started targeting roadside drug testing, they really smashed the North Coast. They really smashed the North Coast. Community around Lismore, Nimbin, Byron Bay, that's really where they targeted. There and in southwest Sydney, that's really where they targeted. And David was confronted in doing his job as a magistrate day in, day out, and dealing with what was undoubtedly a crooked set of laws, people losing their livelihoods, getting fined thousands of dollars, losing their licence in a victimless crime where they were never causing any harm to others. And he was a voice on the bench for reform. He was the kind of magistrate that if you were a decent person with a genuine story, you really wanted to get, because he tried to do everything he could within the law to make it as fair as he could. But an unfair law is an unfair law. And a magistrate has a tough time dealing with unfair laws. I'll let David tell you the rest of his story, but we are lucky to have David. He left the bench in 2019, and he's now been one of those highly sought after voices for law reform more broadly, but especially on roadside drug testing. David, we're so lucky to have you here tonight. I'll throw over to you.
Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. It's an honour, and I'm coming from Bundjalung country, which is up near Byron Bay. That, of course, is not in lockdown. So perhaps I'm one of the few people who are not. I'm going to do the share screen business. So someone will tell me if that doesn't work. How's that going? Is it looking good?
All good, David.
All good, great. So I left the bench a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons was because, I mean, we had a lot of sniffer dogs, but more stupid than that was our drug driving detection laws. Mostly, I say more stupid because it was really impacting on huge numbers of people. In my court in Lismore, probably 50 a week were coming before me for drug driving offences, and they were drug driving detection offences. And I couldn't cope, really. I couldn't cope with the unfairness of it. Most of them were medicinal cannabis users. Many of them were on prescription, and yet their lives were ruined by these laws. So I'd like to have a quick look at them and then open it up for David and discussion. You were going to tell me the running sheet, David, and then we didn't get too far, but let's keep going. So when I left the bench, a group of people called, and we formed a group called Drive Change under the banner of Honolulu. They said to me, well, we want to really talk about people who are on medicinal cannabis. And I suppose my first thought was, well, why just medicinal cannabis? I mean, it should be anybody's use. And they convinced me that this was such a blatant area that we would get change within, hopefully, a very short period of time. Well, 18 months later, here we are, still battling, realizing yet again that when anything comes up about drug law, it's a fight, and it's long and it's slow. So if you take cannabis, there's a lot of people who are taking cannabis medicine now. There are about 65,000 patients in Australia. It's estimated there'll be 100,000 by the end of this year. Almost 70% of them have a medicine that contains THC in it. Now, that is the substance that is detected when you are driving, and then you do the lick stick and the other tests that apply. And if you have been driving and it is detectable in your system, then that is the offence. It's important to note, and this comes up all the time, whenever you argue against drug driving, people go, we don't want people driving when they're drugged. We don't want people driving all over the place looking dangerous. And of course, that's right. And that is furphy number one, really. The argument is always raised, well, people are going to be drug driving and it's dangerous. They're weaving all over the road and hitting other people. Those offences, that is driving under the influence, having an affectation by THC or any other drug, will always still be a law, as it should be. We don't want people driving when they're dangerous. But this is drug driving detection laws, which only require 5 nanograms to be detected. That's 5 billionths of a gram in your mouth. So in New South Wales, and it's a bit, I think Sniff Off is pretty New South Wales centric, but there's probably people from other areas, but New South Wales is typical of all states. It says something very simple in section 111, which is if you have the presence of a prescribed illicit drug, one of which of course is THC, in your oral fluid, blood or urine, then you just can't drive. And if you do, you're guilty of the offence. It's a very simple, straightforward offence. Of course, it never used to be there. It only came in fairly recent times. Then there was an explosion of testing. It came in largely to try and stop truck drivers using what was then termed speed. But here we are with THC that is, of course, fat soluble, stays in your system for a long time. So there are 500,000 road saliva tests in Australia each year. That number is growing rapidly. In New South Wales, that comes straight from the road safety budget. That is meant to be guardrails and things like that, and goes to the police service on a fee-for-service basis. They get paid per test, which is an addition to their budget. Wonder why they're so supportive of drug driving. Interesting. The strike rate for all drugs is 8%. Over 80% of those are THC. So really, even though it says it's drug driving detection, what it really is, for 80% of the time, is THC detection. Now, THC is detectable in your saliva for up to 9 days. That's the longest I found it to be detectable. And in your blood, of course, for even longer, and in your hair samples and things for even longer than that. That is different to water-soluble drugs like MDMA, like alcohol, and they go out of your system far more quickly. So THC is particularly problematic, especially seeing on your medication, it says take daily or take twice daily. You are always going to have a level of THC in your system if you're taking your medicine as prescribed. Only 10% of people who go to court will keep their licenses. The rest will lose their licenses. And we all know what that means. I suppose it's bad enough in the city, but in the country, rural and regional areas, it means you lose your job. It means you can't go and visit your family. It means your sense of social isolation grows. And people then lose their houses. They lose everything if they lose their license. Are there any defenses? Well, I would like $1 for every time people say, well, I have a prescription, so I'm right. And they say, I've got my prescription. It's in the glove box. I'll just show the police officer that. No, That is false. Everywhere does, except Tasmania, and of course, almost everywhere overseas, there is no defence in New South Wales, Queensland, etc. All the mainland states and territories have no defence for having a medical prescription. Now let's think about that. To get a medical prescription, you go to a doctor, the doctor says, this is the drug you need for your condition. And if you take it, you can't drive. Wacko. Are there any other defences? Well, there is a narrow defence of honest and reasonable mistake of fact, which means you really didn't believe you had any THC in your system. That's what has happened for people who go a week or 9 days, people who passively use, as we'll see in a moment. It's a rare circumstance where you can raise this defence. It's only been successfully raised, to my knowledge, 20 or 30 times in New South Wales. It's not available in Queensland at all because they just don't allow that defence. It's statutorily removed. If it's an emergency, well, there is that as a defence if you're driving to the hospital because you're bleeding to death, that sort of case. Passive smoking, I dismissed cases. Cases are dismissed for people who are picked up passive smoking, and there is no doubt that you can get picked up for passive smoking. So if you're in a panel van, and I'm aging myself terribly, if you're in a van sitting around with a group of people smoking a bong and you don't smoke, so you breathe deeply, you can get picked up on the test, and people have. People also have been carers for people who are dying who use a lot of cannabis. There is also a run of cases that have been run up here recently, particularly by a local solicitor, Eddie Lloyd. She's not a Green, she's Labor, but still. And she's been successfully running them on the basis of that they weren't wearing gloves, they didn't follow proper protocols. Good on you, Eddie. The whole thing about the randomness, it's meant to be random drug driving tests. And there are cases and authorities that say that if it's not random, it's not legal. These are, I threw out a few of those cases as a magistrate. There's a few more being run. It's tough going, but it is a possible defence. Of course, what should be happening is the police should not be charging people who have a prescription. In my experience, I have heard of no cases where the police have exercised their discretion not to prosecute someone who's got a prescription. There is provision for the DPP to take over any prosecution and decline to charge. In fact, that's how the Netherlands got its drug laws. The prosecutor made a decision not to do that. That has not happened either in New South Wales, despite attempts to engage the DPP. So here's some falsehoods. Firstly, it's random. Well, it's not random. They stop cars on the basis, or sometimes it's random, but largely it's not. It's number plate recognition determines how they pull over cars. So people with what they call, I'm just turning off my heater, criminal intelligence, inverted commas, God forbid. And also, they target festivals, they target the Mardi Gras. David got lick-sticked, so did Kate Fairman at the recent Mardi Gras. They waved me through. It was a miracle because I've been tested 6 times in recent times. So there you go. It's about road safety. That's garbage. It's nothing to do with road safety. Where is the evidence? When they introduced things like seatbelts, when they introduced 50-kilometre-an-hour speed limits, airbags, etc., there was a random breath testing, rapid decline in the road toll, 0 decline in the road toll as a result of this. And indeed, they don't even argue there has been. I've yet to see anyone mount that argument. I don't want to bore you with the correlation and causation thing, but suffice it to say, and David spoke about this really clearly, and I wrote down what he said now, so I repeat it regularly, which is essentially this, that just because there is a percentage, whatever the percentage of people with THC in their system as a result of fatalities, does not mean that that caused any accidents. Indeed, many of them are pedestrians or passengers in motor vehicles. There is yet to be any evidence that people who use medicinal cannabis have caused a single death on the road or injury or collision. The evidence is just not there that it's about road safety. DUI will remain, driving under the influence will remain in every state and territory, and so it should, which is a real straw man argument. Well, it's illegal to use drugs anyway, so what's wrong with having drug driving laws? Well, we all know that's crap. Prescription cannabis is not illegal. It's not illicit. Cannabis has straddled this weird divide between illegal and suddenly it's prescription. That doesn't happen very often, that you still have a drug that's illegal available by prescription. And of course, people can lawfully smoke in the ACT. They can lawfully smoke in Portugal, when pre-COVID anyway, and fly to Australia and then get tested. So it actually has nothing to do with illegality at all. Illicit drugs are a major cause of road trauma. Well, that's not true. Prescription drugs cause far more deaths and injuries. And in particular, as I said, medicinal cannabis, well, where's the evidence? It's only a traffic offence, you don't get a criminal record. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of the difference between a criminal record, a traffic record, and a court record, but suffice it to say that when you make declarations on your insurance, when you seek employment, very often they will say, have you appeared in court for a drug offence? Well, what are you going to say to that? And the answer is clearly yes. That's what they ask, for example, on the visa to America. It's not, have you been convicted? Have you been in court charged with one of these things? So they all have to be declared, and it all costs you. That this discourages drug use. Well, drug driving probably does stop some people using medicinal cannabis, but it also then leads to more alcohol and more prescription drugs, and probably more illicit drugs of different varieties, arguably more harmful drugs than cannabis. Granting a medical exemption is impossible. Well, that's bullshit. It's done, here's the Tasmanian law. A person does not commit an offence against subsection 1 if the prescribed illicit drug was obtained and administered in accordance with the Poisons Act. Not as exciting as the one that David put forward in the upper house, but nevertheless provides a defence for people who obtained and administered in accordance with their prescription. As I said, Canada, UK, EU, many parts of the USA, it's easy to do and there's no real drama with it. You just make a defence. It doesn't infect insurance if it's at a detectable level. That is false. Have a look at the AAMI policy when you've got a dry, boring lockdown week. Go to their PDF and have a look, and you'll see that what it says is that if you have any illicit drug in your system, saliva, blood, urine, your insurance is void. So if you are detected, you have a car accident and you get this lipstick system, that's it, bingo, no insurance. So I haven't looked at all the insurers, but there's a lot there where this is problematic. Prescription drugs are safer than cannabis. Well, tell that to people who drive on opioids, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, sleeping medications. In fact, I think that I'd love to see a study on this. David, maybe there has been, but a study that shows that if you're driving in pain, the most dangerous driving I ever did was when I had my children in the car screaming at me, let alone using opioids, barbiturates, or benzodiazepines. The point I'm trying to make is that THC at medicinal levels is certainly less dangerous than prescription drugs. Now, what we've got is a really interesting situation soon where pharmacies will be able to give out CBD. When I say give out, you'll pay for it over the counter. That's really interesting because it can have up to 1% THC. Now, who knows whether that will show up in mouth swabs? I think it will. I think it will for the first couple of hours after taking it. So I guess we're going to get a new wave of people charged with that. The impact on industry is going to be very severe. I think that we cannot have a viable cannabis industry in Australia without changes to the drug driving laws. And I'm pleased to say that the industry has really come on board and has helped fund, not me, but helped fund drive change in terms of putting together material like this and our whole campaign. Australia, well, there's bills with Victorian Parliament and South Australian Parliament to change the drug driving laws. Do I think they'll succeed? No, I don't. The actual police have spoken out against any change. They are biased in this debate for a whole range of reasons, not least of which because they get money per test. This is a budgetary thing for them. It also enables them to stop and and deal with people who they otherwise could not, but they want to. So this is about Drive Change. We're here, we're doing stuff. Go to our website and have a look. Here's the nice mob of Drive Change. Obviously the only old one there. Although I reckon Gino's catching up with me, but the rest are really young, savvy, activist people in the medicinal cannabis movement. All of them have worked for industry, and you know, they're a great mob to work with, I have to say, and they keep me honest. We also have ambassadors, including David, and these are our supporters in terms of assisting us financially to keep this campaign going. In the end, ultimately, it's a question of discrimination. Why is cannabis the only prescription drug that faces drug detection regimes? It's the only one. And we all know why that is. It's because they hate cannabis. Who wins? The pharmaceutical industry wins by drug driving laws because more people take more pills. The other people who win is the alcohol industry because people keep drinking. They are the two biggest political donors, at least in this area, and I think statewide they rate. So is it any wonder we're not getting a lot of change when you add the police, the pharmaceutical industry, and the alcohol industry? We want change, and it's not happening real quick. So one way you can help is sign our petition. Go to change.org and our Drive Change MC petition. I think it's up to about 8,000 signatures. We want it at 1 million. Not too much to ask. Okay, so that is the end of my little set of screens, and I'm going to go off screen share and open it up for whatever's next, maybe questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, David. I hope that was super informative for everyone. And if you do have any follow-up questions, again, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A and we'll definitely come through to you a little bit later. What I wanted to take some time now to do is just chat about some of the really individual personal stories that have been impacted by these roadside drug testing laws. I put a post up on Sniff Off last week, just calling out for anyone who had those experiences like David had talked about with RDTs, and I got a huge response from the Sniff Off community. You were all very generous with some really personal and really heartbreaking stories, and I thought they were worthwhile sharing in an anonymous capacity, just so anyone who might not see the individual impact of what David has just talked about, maybe you can put a little face to those issues. So the first story that I wanted to share says, I failed a roadside drug test, and at the station, I was given a 24-hour prohibition from driving and a March court date. I got a lawyer hoping for a Section 10 as a conviction would lose me my job. And when it gets to my court date, the judge says he would not be issuing a Section 10 as you got one 10 years ago and you should have learnt. The Section 10 was for something completely different. The judge didn't care that I was going to lose my job. And to make matters worse, I had my partner in the car at the time, which the judge said made it worse, but I wasn't even charged with driving under the influence. I lost my license for 3 months, then lost my job due to the conviction. I have a baby on the way, so it all couldn't have come at a worse time. And I just think this is a really, really demonstrative of exactly what David was talking about. The offence wasn't that this person was driving under the influence. They were charged with presence, and they've lost their license, lost their job, and they've got a baby on the way. And how are these laws keeping us safe? The next story we had, a really short, but unfortunately not so sweet. I have stomach-related issues which lead to severe nausea. I take prescription CBD and THC drops for treatment. I had a drop, no more than a microdose, and then had to drive to work. Far from impaired, but because it was present, I failed a roadside drug test. Fined close to $600 and can't drive for 6 months. I mean, I could be impaired on codeine and driving, but they don't test for that, so it's okay. Ridiculous. And they say it for themselves, really, there. It's so unfortunate this person is literally taking medicine for stomach pain that their GP has said that would be good for them. and yet they've been fined what for some people is an obscene amount of money. I know it would be for me. And they've lost their job. It's just these individual impacts of these laws that are really falling down, especially now that cannabis is legal and prescribed. It's appalling. The impact is really appalling. And then my final story kind of highlights as well the point that David made about this isn't random, it is targeted, and we all know it. The police are pulling up at festivals all the time to try and catch people out. And there were a lot of stories that people shared with us about feeling unfairly targeted by police that had sought out, you know, a chance to bust someone. So this person's story goes, I attended Splendor in the Grass in 2015 and consumed drugs. I was pulled over and arrested on my way back home a few days after the festival finished. I tested positive for cannabis. I went to court, and although I had legal representation and pleaded for a no conviction, I still received a conviction. I was a penultimate year law student at the time, so it ruined my chances of landing any part-time job at a law firm. The conviction also meant that I couldn't go to the UK for my final uni semester for exchange. I was banned from the UK for 2 years after an unsuccessful visa application on the basis of my conviction. The parents of my girlfriend at the time also found out about my situation and banned her from seeing me. We ended up breaking up. Nicely, they do say at the end that it took them ages, but they finally got a job and now work as a lawyer. And that's amazing. And I'm so glad that they were able to get through that. But I think it's all pretty clear that this person acted responsibly. They waited for a few days after even taking it to ensure that they weren't affected on the road, yet tested for presence, and then their entire career is put on hold. They lose a relationship. They don't get the chance to go abroad. And for what? For a drug that we just don't like, that the government's just decided they don't like. Steams me. It really makes me mad. And I just thought it was really important to share those stories, to like I said, put an individual face to these issues, and make it clear just how deep these impacts can go. I was hoping now that, David, you can take a chance to just talk about the ways that we can change this shitty situation.
Sure. And thanks, Olivia. And look, thanks everybody for sharing those stories through Sniff Off. I can tell you now that in our office, hearing those stories, understanding what the real world impacts are of these very broken drug laws is part of what really drives us and keeps us coming back and back and back again until we actually fix the law. So I know it's a bit tough sometimes to share those stories. And I know, Olivia, it can, you hear about so many people's lives being just thrown into chaos by a particularly stupid drug law. But it's really important we get those messages. Could I remind everybody to pop questions in the Q&A panel? If you're on Facebook, we are monitoring the Facebook chat feed, and we'll try and drag them across into the Q&A. But if you're on the Zoom, put them in the Q&A feed. So look, I don't want to add a huge amount about how broken the law is and about how it's not working, because I think between David and Olivia, I think the case is proven. I think we could convict these drug laws of being totally non-fit for purpose, and bang, we could sentence them to being stripped off the statute books. So we know they're bad. But why aren't we getting change? Well, I think one of the reasons is that it's not in the interest of the pharmaceutical industry, and it's not in the interest of the police to have these changes. Because if you really wanted to grapple with the drug driving laws, you'd have to start saying, well, we're going to test for impairment. And it doesn't really matter whether the drug is legal or illegal. If a level of drug in your system creates unsafe driving, well, then that's what we should be testing for, and that's what we should be trying to discourage and remove people from the roads when they have that. And if we did do that, if we were testing blind to whether or not the drugs are legal or illegal, and we were just testing for impairment, well, then benzodiazepines would be really in the target of the New South Wales Police Force. And of course, that would really upset the pharmaceutical industry, and they have no interest in doing that. Because of all the gross unfairness that you see in this scheme, one of the things that really gets me, and it's about unfairness and road safety, is you can go to something like Mardi Gras, that cannabis law reform festival in Nimbin, which David was talking to. And in that little patch where we weren't locked down, I went to that earlier this year. So did my colleague, Kate Fairman. And to get into Nimbin, it was like entering an occupied zone, like was literally surrounded. They talk about a ring of steel around Sydney for COVID. Well, that was nothing compared to what they threw around Nippon or Nimbin. It was literally a ring of police all around it. Like each of the 4 entry points into Nimbin, I think it's 4, each of them had a group of about 30 police at each entrance point, sometimes more, sometimes less, multiple police vehicles, multiple vans. And they were stopping pretty much everybody and randomly checking them for cannabis. And it was an extraordinary use of police resources. And they, you know, for the first time ever, they stopped me. I thought I was somehow immune to it because I'd driven past so many of them. I thought maybe my middle-class white maleness was protecting me. In a police sort of, you know, target, they often like targeting young people, people of colour, people with, you know, with older vehicles and the like. You know, they have their kind of real targeted mentality. But they eventually pulled me over and yeah, twice in that weekend, pulled over, tested, and an incredible waste of our time. But somebody could have come after me, all been driving before me, and gone to any one of those 4 blockades. They could have been zonked to the eyeballs on benzodiazepines, absolutely zonked, you know, and they would have just been waved through. They would have had the saliva test, and they just been waved through because they're not testing for that. And the road trauma data from around the world shows that, in fact, a high level of benzodiazepines is one of the key indicators for actual road trauma and for not being able to control a vehicle and for causing road trauma, as opposed to there being no studies at all, that show a tiny trace element of THC picked up by a super sensitive test has any impact at all on your driving. It just doesn't. So, I mean, they're the kind of things we're confronting. Last year, there was an opportunity to try and get a bit of movement on this in the New South Wales Parliament. There was some law reform coming in this space, in drug driving space. And it was talking about combination of drugs a little bit, alcohol and cannabis and others. And, you know, we do need to talk about combination of drugs because a combination of drugs can be actually much, much more dangerous than any one drug by itself in terms of driver safety. And we sought in the course of that to have an amendment put in the law to have it as a defence, that if you were using cannabis for a medicinal purpose, it was a defence to a charge of having just the presence of cannabis in your system. It would have still meant that if you had cannabis at a level that was impacting your driving, you could still be caught for impaired driving, but you wouldn't be caught for just the mere presence offence. And we thought that that was a real opportunity to change the law and put some fairness, make it similar to Tasmania, but a little bit more permissive than the Tasmanian laws. We got only, I think, 2 other votes, apart from the Greens MPs in the upper house, to support that. And I think those votes came from the Animal Justice Party, so I credit them for throwing their support behind it. But we got absolute resistance from the coalition, fed by the police, and we also had Labor come forward, and I think they realise that there's a constituency that thinks this is all wrong, you know, and that there should be change. And Labor, I think, for the first time made it clear that they realise there's a problem. They said on the record, look, we realise there's a bit of a problem here. We're a bit concerned about it. We would consider having an inquiry into it. Maybe we'd look at that in the future. And so there's this tiny semi-window of opportunity with Labor to at least look into it, which was actually a change for their position. I mean, they put in these drug driving laws over a decade ago. But I think it's going to be really hard scrabble to get that kind of reform through the New South Wales Parliament. That's why we need to build the campaign. That's why the petition is so important. That's why I've become an ambassador for the Drive Change campaign, because I think we really need to make this a national campaign. That's why I'm so glad we have people like David who are speaking about it with all that experience and that just, you know, extraordinary level of knowledge about just how unfair it works. And that's why I'm glad we've got Sniff Off on the case. And we're hearing your stories and we're sharing your stories because we need to change these laws. People's lives are being thrown into chaos, not for drivers, not for driver safety, not for road safety, but because of an ideological attack against just one drug. And it's about time it bloody ended. And I really think that the community campaign is essential. We can probably have an exchange in the Q&A about how, you know, just going down a parliamentary route in Victoria just didn't manage to fix it. We only had a report in the last few days coming out of Victoria that people were looking for maybe some change in this space, but it kind of got smashed down by Labor and the coalition. I think we need to build that social campaign. Yeah. So thanks, Olivia.
Amazing. Thank you, David. So now what we're going to do is just throw to some questions. We've got some questions coming through in the chat and Q&A from Facebook. So I'm really hoping I don't miss anything. So if don't panic, I will get to you all as much as I can, and just keep putting those questions in Q&A if they come up. The first question that I have, I'm going to throw to you, Mr. Shoebridge, and I'm going to switch to last names at this stage because otherwise it's going to get far too confusing.
But can I just say, for anyone listening, that is the first time Olivia has called me Mr. Shoebridge. So it's fascinating. I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't expecting it. Why don't we call David your worship?
Let's do it. Is that cool? So the question is, isn't there a national decriminalisation set back in 2018 by the federal government, and New South Wales has an overarching control in their borders?
Look, that's a really good that's a really interesting discussion. I mean, when the ACT moved to do its sort of largely decriminalisation approach on cannabis, growing cannabis and cannabis possession for personal use, the Commonwealth government made some harumphing noises. They were official parliamentary harumphing noises about saying that maybe the Commonwealth prohibitions would be enforced, because there are Commonwealth laws made by the Commonwealth Parliament about making it illegal to have drugs, and then there are territory and state laws. You know, the ACT is a territory. It's kind of the equivalent of a state. It has laws at a state level that make it illegal, or used to make it illegal, to have drug possession. And so when the ACT changed their laws, there was a concern that there may be a directive from the Commonwealth government to enforce Commonwealth laws in the ACT and reverse the law reform there. That actually hasn't happened in practice. And I think the reality is that would be next to impossible to get that to happen in a state like New South Wales, where we have a separate police force. They wouldn't take direction from the Commonwealth government in that regard. But there's always the risk that the Commonwealth can come and assert their position. I just think that's going to land the Commonwealth in a whole world of trouble and pain if they try and do that. But David may have some more sophisticated thought on that.
No, I agree entirely with what Mr. Shoebridge said. I mean, I think the ACT is a little beacon of hope, because what we're not seeing is the sky falling in, people running all around with no clothes on, increasing crime, increasing hospitalisation. We're not seeing any of that with the change, just like we didn't see in Portugal, the Netherlands, most of the United States, or anywhere else. Unsurprising. But the fact that it does exist is really precious. Interestingly, they have not changed their drug driving laws. Their drug driving laws mimic ours. So despite the fact that there it's virtually decriminalised, matters not. You still can't drive with a detectable level in your system.
There was actually a comment made on the Sniff Off page just crying that you can do something perfectly legal on the weekend and then lose your license on Monday driving to work for that exact reason.
You know, it's a really good point, and I perhaps should have made it earlier, and that is this: if you're a young man or woman going out on a Friday night and you want to get out of it, which is just fine, then you could drink. You'd be right on Monday. You'd probably spend $150. You could take ice, which would probably cost you $20 or $25, and you'd be fine to drive on Monday. You could take mushrooms and you'd be fine to drive on Monday. You could do whatever you liked except use cannabis.
And on that, Olivia, there's been repeated concerns. Admittedly, they're anecdotal, but they have been so common and so repeated coming to my office about these drug driving laws actually having a substitution effect, particularly in the regions where your license is so precious. And that substitution effect is having people move from cannabis to ice and actually exacerbating the ice pandemic in much of regional New South Wales. And I've had so many reports to that effect that I would, if nothing else comes from this forum, if there's an academic listening to it and was in a position to actually do a study and have a look at that substitution effect, that is so concerning for me, and I think for other people, that I think, you know, so many anecdotal reports. So I can't help but think that the fear about being caught for drug driving with cannabis is producing that, you know, quite, I think, really unhelpful substitution effect, particularly in the regions.
All right, great question. I'll throw to Your Worship, I feel like Elle Wood saying that. With the defences of drug driving, people need to be able to afford to fight the process. How is that fair when police obviously use this random testing to target people? Why do we have to put our hands in our pockets to show they're wrong?
It is completely unfair. And I think the stories that you read out, and weren't they moving? I mean, you know, really, these people's lives are being destroyed by these laws. Even if it was just a fine and not a disqualification, I think we would be going a long way. It's the disqualification that kills. Hence, people get expensive legal representation. But I think the really important point of those stories is that even the expensive representation, I think in 2 out of the 3 of those stories, even the private representation did not help them get a Section 10, did not help them keep their license. And therein lies part of the problem. Is there are a cohort, probably about 50% of magistrates in this state, who refuse to give Section 10s to those who are medicinal cannabis users. It's absurd.
Can I tell you, what this also highlights is just how it's a lucky dip, depending on what magistrate you get. I mean, we pretend that the law is equal across the state, but in this regard, it really is a lucky dip. You get a good magistrate who's willing to listen and understands how it's a victimless crime and really unfair. They'll go out of their way to give you a Section 10. And David didn't give himself enough credit, I think, in some of his presentation. He referred to this Carroll case where there was a defence of reasonable mistake of fact, which actually gets you entirely off the charge if you can prove that you had no reasonable way of thinking that you would actually have cannabis in your system when you were driving. The magistrate who actually crafted that judgment, which has then been repeatedly used by other magistrates, and the police at one point tried to take it to the Supreme Court and realised that they were on a hiding for nothing because the law was so good. The magistrate from memory who did that judgment was a bloke called Heilpern, David Heilpern, wasn't it, David? Yeah.
Love how that ties together. So I'm actually going to throw this to Your Worship again, only because I feel like this might be a little difficult for Mr. Shoebridge to answer. The question is, what is Labor's position on drug law reform?
Well, I think we saw that in quite recent times. There was a mooted, pathetic, limp change as a result of the ICE inquiry. The response to that was the leaking by from Cabinet to the Daily Telegraph. And here I was thinking, well, Labor must have some soul. Instead, they sent from Canberra, of all places, Christine Keneally, to slam these limp-wristed changes as being soft on crime, and how the Labor Party couldn't possibly support any of these changes to the drug laws. Labor's policy, I mean, look, there are some people who privately in Labor say they want to see change, generally on the left, some of them, all of them from the backbench. But the truth is that they are gutless, spineless, and there is no evidence that the Labor Party has any appetite for taking on any kind of drug law reform, even the most minimal drug law reform that you could imagine, which is just to allow those with prescription THC to be able to have a defence to the drug driving laws. Not one word of support from any minister, from any member of the shadow cabinet, or any backbencher. Now, ironically, and I think this is bizarre, but it's true, the only politicians who have been speaking out in favour of the drug driving laws, except for Greens and Independents, have been Nationals. And in federal parliament, we had just recently a federal backbencher from the National Party stand up and say how stupid these drug driving laws are, and quote me, go figure.
All right, thank you, David. So we might go to the next question. All right, this is for Mr. Shoebridge. You've had a bill at the state level which was knocked back. How might the drive change position affect a future bill?
Well, I mean, my view is if I could pretend I could put another bill up tomorrow and there'd be some sort of revolution in the thinking of parliamentarians in New South Wales and we would get major change. But to be honest, I don't think that will work. I think there's a role for putting up positive law reform, showing how the world could be better and building a campaign around it. And we do that quite often. And sometimes that gets us incremental change and we move towards a goal. But right now, the work really needs to be out there in the community. And that's why I think what Drive Change are doing with multiple ambassadors, MPs from around the country coming together, getting a bit of critical mass around this, and then also working with people in civil society and actually building that campaign and pointing out how unfair it is. I think if you'd asked me 2 years ago, could we get a rogue Nat in the federal parliament who was willing to talk out against these laws, I would have thought we wouldn't. But I think what has been really critical for the work that Drive Change has done, I think some of the work in other state parliaments, and I'd say the work of Sniff Off and my office, has we've made the case. Like, we've really made the case for change. We've pointed out how these laws are broken, how they randomly visit such unfairness against people without a road safety goal. And I think we've won the argument. But the challenge is winning the politics. And, you know, we can see it with climate change. You can see it with all manner of hard political issues. You can win the case, win the intellectual case. The challenge, particularly in our somewhat cooked political system, is winning the politics. And that's where we need the big community campaign.
Brilliant. All right, next question for your worship. Taking my appeal to district and later High Court is a strategy, as it could create a legal precedent, especially if we could establish impairment levels somewhere in the process. What are your thoughts about how this could work?
Good question. Once you appeal to the district court, you can't appeal any higher except on a question of law. So in effect, there's only one appeal, and that is to the district court from the magistrate's court. Saying that you weren't impaired is not a defence, because it's assumed. It's actually not an element of the offence that you were impaired. If I was tech savvy enough, I'd go back to the slide that shows the offence. It's only presence that needs to be proved. They don't need to prove impairment. And in fact, even if you could prove to the satisfaction of the court, even if you could absolutely prove beyond any doubt that you were not impaired, then it would not be a defence to this charge in the local district or any court. So the thought of running a challenge to these laws, of course, has been considered on a range of options, yet to be successful and yet to find any holes to pick in the laws that would enable such an appeal to be successful. I mean, I think there's a momentum, though, outside the courts. I don't think you're going to... Law and justice are often distant relatives, and in this case, they really are. And I think the momentum is also going to be because there is going to be a tsunami of people using medicinal cannabis. I mean, it works. It really does work. These hippies have had something, known something for a while, and it makes a big difference to people's lives, whether it be children who have epilepsy or people who are suffering from the effects of chemotherapy or people just with residual pain or people with insomnia or people with PTSD. This stuff works. And when there's 500,000 people taking prescriptions, I think there will be a lot more pressure for change, but it won't come through the courts. It can only come through the community and therefore Parliament.
Yeah, I might just quickly add to that, Olivia. We often have people contact Sniff Off and contact my office and say, but what about our rights? You know, what about our right to be free of this and our right to be free of that? Well, I wish we lived in a country where those rights were kind of really clear and unambiguous, but unfortunately we live in Australia. And for those of us in New South Wales, you live in one of the parts of the world which has pretty much no Bill of Rights. State, local, federal, there's no Bill of Rights for us. And when you go through law school, and I remember being tortured by Sydney University Law School for some 5 years, one of the things they teach you is that the New South Wales Parliament, if it chooses, can make the most obscene and offensive and irrational laws. And there's really no restraint on them, apart from, you know, they can't jump over what the Commonwealth has done. But apart from that, the New South Wales Parliament can do any stupid kind of law. And this is one of those stupid kind of laws that the New South Wales Parliament has passed. And so the likelihood of challenging it within the legal system is pretty limited. We actually need to, build the case in the community. And thankfully, medicinal cannabis is actually running a fair chunk of the case for us. It's a really effective way of dealing with some chronic pain in particular for people, where all other drugs either have terrible side effects or are ineffective. It's proven time and time again, particularly with some childhood epilepsy, that it's the only effective drug that can keep people safe and save their lives. It's making the case for us, which is why Drive Change is really focusing for a start on medicinal cannabis and drug driving law reform, because it's just such an obvious case of injustice.
Thank you, David. And I think it's also worth highlighting that even these rights, which are quite nebulous, a concept to enforce, we all know that they're not enforced equally across all groups of people as well. Even if you've got something, we all know that particular people can be stopped or targeted by the police. And there is a question here that I might throw to you, Your Worship. That is, are fines the only penalty? Is incarceration a penalty? And is there a double standard when a First Nations person fails the test?
Incarceration is not available for the offence of drug detection driving on its own. But, and this is a big but, and this of course affects First Nations people far more than many others. These laws are used to stop and you are required to provide your license. So if, for example, you're driving while you're disqualified or driving without a license, then the penalty regimes are greater. But the second thing is, of course, once you lose your license, many people still try to drive to the shops, many people still try to drive, and then drive while disqualified does carry a jail term. So these laws on their own, in isolation, don't carry a jail term. But what they do carry is a disqualification, which then leads to a jail term, in the sense that if you then drive while you're disqualified, and they lead to interaction with the police of themselves, that can lead to imprisonment. And of course, we all know how that pans out for First Nations people. The drive while under the influence, so the more serious offences that we're not really talking about, they do carry a term of imprisonment.
And Olivia, I mean, I think it's a point that Sniff Off hopefully is constantly, remaking and repeating, that laws that on the face of them don't look discriminatory, particularly when they give police discretion or additional police powers, in practice, they can be really, really brutally discriminatory. And as we said, we had the data from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, which kind of the numbers people when it comes to crime and punishment in New South Wales. That data is a bit old now. We're actually hoping to get a refresh of that data. But that showed when they were first started really going on drug driving, they smashed parts of the state with much lower average incomes. There was the North Coast and it was Southwest Sydney. And almost no tests were done on the North Shore or the eastern suburbs of Sydney. There was Southwest Sydney and the North, which and the north of the state, which were really getting smashed. And we see that with stop and searches for drugs. We see that with drug dog use, that they're constantly targeting particular communities. We've seen that recently with COVID and the policing of West and Southwest Sydney in COVID. And particularly from Aboriginal communities in the regions. Again, a lot of the anecdotal reporting that I've got, some of it even coming from the Aboriginal Legal Service, is because so many people in the Aboriginal community have lost their licence because of unpaid fines, because they've been caught, driving with a defective car or caught in a parking offence or picked up another fine, and that can then lead to your licence being lost because you get disqualified and you lose your licence. That some of the last people in these communities are then losing their licence on these drug driving laws for cannabis use with a tiny trace element of cannabis. And literally the last driving licence in some of these families and more remote Aboriginal communities has been lost. That then leads to unlicensed driving. And as David said, that's what can land you in jail. And, we see that time and time again.
All right, so there are still a lot of questions left, and I'm sorry, but I am mindful that we are close to time. So I'm going to have one more question, and we will try to answer any other questions. If you want to send through messages to the Sniff Off page or to the Drive Change team, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to discuss them with you. But I'm going to aim for something hopefully a little bit more uplifting with this last question and throw it to the both of the Davids. I haven't driven a car since receiving a script 2 years ago. Ubers love me, cost a fortune to go anywhere or get to do a thing. Will I ever drive again in New South Wales?
Yes, you will. And you know, I don't want to be too optimistic, and I don't want to be too much of an in-joke either, but a mutual friend of David's and mine has been saying, Alex Wodak has been saying for at least 30 years, oh, another 6 months we'll have decriminalisation of cannabis in New South Wales, maybe 9 months. But I do think within the next few years we'll see, and for the reasons that I gave before, the numbers will start to build. Already, most of the police I talk to, someone in their family is using medicinal cannabis for whatever purpose. Already, we're seeing politicians, families, and some movement in the National Party, which, because it has its roots in the country, I think, and has sort of a bit of an agrarian libertarian streak, is some move for change. So I do think in the next few years we will see Tasmanian-style laws. Could be wrong, but that's what I think. So just keep hanging in there, keep using your Uber. But I think that another few years we will see change. I guess there's one other thing as well, and that is, and part of it's myth, but I think that the Nim and Hemp Embassy and some others are doing some very interesting experimentation with different substances by way of mouthwash as to what defeats the tests. And that's pretty exciting when you think about it, because and so, you know, the plan is that eventually is to get someone like the Lambert Institute or someone proper to actually run some tests and see which mouthwash and which Alka-Seltzer tablet or whatever actually does defeat the test, because there's nothing like a bit of civil disobedience to change things. But if the science can be thrown out a bit by that, then we might see change a bit quicker.
Yeah, I love the concept of creative civil disobedience against really, really dumb laws. So the thought of the Nimb and Hemp Embassy chemist lab out the back coming up with a solution, I find very amusing and heartening, David. But we'll see where that goes. Can I say to the person who asked that question, yeah, we will fix these laws. We will change these laws, because really, really stupid, non-fit for purpose laws, eventually, you know, that long arc of justice, it eventually comes to a landing point, and we eventually get rid of these really, really stupid laws. I'd love it to be the Alex Wodak 6 months arc. I think it's a longer arc that we're going to go on. So I'm sorry, Uber's going to keep squeezing you for a little bit longer. But let your local MP know. Join up with Sniff Off, share the word on Sniff Off. Share the petition, sign and share the petition. It's a long arc, that arc of justice, but really dumb laws eventually get scrubbed off the statute books. I'd love to be part of doing that, and I hope Sniff Off is part of doing that. And I know that the Drive Change campaign that David is so instrumental in is going to be a part of that. It's a collective effort. That's how we fix dumb laws.
Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone again so much for coming along tonight. Thank you to the two Davids for sharing your wisdom and sharing your uplifting hopes for the future. As we've said in the chat, if you do have any other questions or any other comments, we love feedback. We'd love to have a chat to you. Please send them through to the Sniff Off and the Drive Change pages. Otherwise, have a great night. Enjoy your weekend as much as you can if you're in lockdown like I am. And let's do another event soon.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks for all your work on this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Olivia.
Everyone.
Thanks, David.